Welcome back. You're tuned into Mid Morning Talk with me, your host, Mariam Mia, and we're going to be speaking about teenage pregnancies. So, Gauteng reported 23,000 teenage pregnancies between April 2020 and March 2021. It the Democratic Alliance said that this was revealed by the MEC for Health in a written reply to questions by the party table in the provincial legislature. According to the MEC, 934 babies were delivered by girls between the ages of 10 and 14, while over 19,000 were delivered by those between the ages of 15 and 19 years old. Nearly 3,000 girls between the ages of 10 and 19 chose to terminate their pregnancies. The DAS called on the Gauteng Departments of Social Development, Education and Health to intensify the campaigns to prevent teenage pregnancies. So their statement by the Shadow MEC for Development said to teach girls in I beg your pardon, to teach girls in society at large the importance of not falling pregnant when they're still young, because when girls fall pregnant, they are the ones who end up looking after babies, and sometimes when there's no proper support system, there's nobody assisting them. While politicians have focused on girls, they haven't really said anything about the men and the boys who are impregnating them. So to help us understand and contextualize this issue, joining me, I have three very learned guests. I have Lithalethemba Stwayi. She's an attorney at the Center for Child Law. Joining me is Buyiswa Mpini. She represents UNESCO as well as the Department of Education. And I've got Dr. Shaheda Omar via telephone from the Teddy Bear Clinic. So let me first welcome Lithalethemba Stwayi. Good morning and welcome to the Salam Media Mid Morning Talk, Lithalethemba.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And then joining us representing UNESCO is Buyiswa Mpini. Good morning and welcome, Buyiswa. Can you unmute your mic for me, please?
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and let me just check if I've got Dr. Shaheda Omar online. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shaheda Omar, and welcome to Mid Morning Talk.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran dalilan for this opportunity.
It's a pleasure. I'm so pleased we've got everybody loud and clear. So I'm going to start off with probably you, Buyiswa, because you work within the Department of Education as well as with UNESCO in terms of such programs through life orientation as well, to empower young teenage girls in terms of, teenage pregnancies, dangers of teenage pregnancies, repercussions of teenage pregnancies. So tell me, in a year when we had a pandemic, social interactions, physical social interactions were curtailed via various lockdowns. Yes, yet we have a staggering amount of teenage pregnancies, and this is just in one province alone. What are your feelings in terms of the reasons behind the high teenage pregnancies rates last year in Gauteng?
Mariam, it's quite a very concerning and worrying, in fact, a horrific picture that we are seeing. And of course, as UNESCO, as well as I think the education sector, we are aware that 2020 was a very unusual year in terms of the pandemic and the lockdown and the loss of schooling, where learners or children were mostly at home rather than in school. And this situation is actually speaking to the fact that as an education sector, we say schools are actually a protective factor when it comes to risky behaviors among adolescents and young people, because through schooling, as you were saying, they receive through the curriculum, information and knowledge and skills, and they are taught values and attitudes in order to make informed decisions when it comes to the issues of their sexual reproductive health. But if we look at the statistics, it's very alarming, especially with the ages of 10 to 14 years. I don't want to say these young kids, these young children, these young girls are actually consenting to sex. I'm saying there is a very horrific picture that is being painted by what has happened with our children when they were at home. There is a rape issue here. There is sexual violence against our children. As much as we understand that some children, some young people, adolescents, they do experiment with sex, but please don't tell me that number of 934 of 10 to 14-year-olds they have consented to sex. We, as a society, we also need to look at ourselves and ask what is happening in our communities that is leading to such high statistics when it comes to issues of teenage pregnancy. And we must also stop only focusing on girls when it comes to the issues of education around the prevention of teenage pregnancy. We must actually also escalate and enhance engagement of young boys as well as men on the responsibility when it comes to issues of preventing early and unintended pregnancies among girls.
Absolutely, I'm in agreement with you, because much of the education and responsibility and burden of bear is always faced. It's always placed on female learners and females in society, mothers, women. I want to bring Dr. Shaheda in now, Dr. Shaheda, because you work with many victims that come with children. With sexual assault cases as well, you interacting with children who are pregnant, those that choose to terminate pregnancy, those that continue and give birth in it. So last year, is it because there was no protective environment of schooling, and that led to these high incidents of teenage pregnancies? What is your understanding and analysis of the situation we find ourselves in now?
So, Mariam, I think we need to understand one thing. It's very clear that if we look at statistics in 2019, the South African Health and Data Survey that was conducted, more than 180,000 teenage pregnancies between the ages of 14 and 19 years were recorded. So I want to bring to the fore that this is not a unique phenomenon. It's not just between 2020 to 2021. This is a very complex issue, and it is a systemic problem which requires systemic intervention. It requires co-responsibility. It requires government departments, civil society, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, all to get involved. Children are a microcosm of the macrocosm. They are only mirroring or reflecting what is actually happening in the broader context of society. So coming to your question of 2020 specifically, yes, children were trapped in their homes during the lockdown. They were immobilized. And I think my learned colleague identified or alluded to the fact of coercion, intimidation, cases of rape. And if we look once again, if we unpack that, we find that at least a third of the cases are actually as a result of force or coercion or intimidation, where children are not in a position to stop this from happening, and of course are victims of rape, victims of unintended pregnancies. And in certain cases, we're looking at intrafamilial abuse, where it's within the family, within the context of people that are closely connected to the victim. And often as a result of that, we find that those cases are not even reported, criminal cases not opened and compensation offered. But we also must factor in the blesser-blessee relationship. And the age of consent, legal age of consent for sex is 16. So a child between the ages of 10 and 14 and 15 cannot give consent, regardless of the fact that they are engaging in sexual experimentation, as was mentioned earlier. We need to understand that, yes, children are children, and they are also exploded and bombarded with a lot of sexual images. We know that in studies conducted at UNESCO, it was found that by the time a boy reaches the age of 10, at least 80% of those children have had access to child porn. So yes, sexual experimentation is something that we do see, but we must also understand that no 10-year-old is actually going into a relationship purely for sexual gratification. No 10 to 14-year-old is going into a relationship to have a baby. They don't even understand the implications of their actions or the consequences of their actions. We've had dialogues with young girls between those ages, and those girls that have had babies already have shared their sufferings, their pain, their trauma, the losses, and the many sacrifices they've had to endure as a result of that. And this is very clear that it wasn't because they were fully informed about the outcome, the unintended consequences and the negative outcome. So I think what my learned colleague alluded to as well is that in terms of interventions, and you mentioned that I think a lot needs to be done on the ground. Not sufficient is being done. And if we just look at the contributory factors, there are so many contributory factors in terms of lack of paucity of sexual knowledge, in terms of dialoguing with children. So where does the responsibility begin and end? Is it just with parents? Is it just with at the educational institution? It's much more than that. It's broader than that. I've identified all the stakeholders. I think we need to bring the corporate sector. We need to bring in the faith-based organizations in as well, where the corporate sector can have, as part of the employee wellness programs, dialogues on how to communicate around the subject, which is often a taboo subject, but also, answering questions, who, what, where, how, because children are not born with an instruction manual. Parents are not given the information that at this age you start speaking to your child about sex and sexuality. At this age, this is what you approach to them about puberty, about pregnancy. I think these are very difficult questions. It may seem, something easily appropriate for us as professionals to discuss, but for the average person out there, even for the most qualified for it, it's not something that comes easily. And a lot more emphasis, focus, resources in terms of personnel, human resources, and budget allocations at various levels, at antenatal clinics, at schools, whether it's preschool, primary school, high school, tertiary institutions, across the spectrum. We need to have community dialogue. And it was very clearly articulated or beautifully articulated. It should include both the girl child, the boy child, the woman, the man. It should include everybody, the LGBTQIA community as well. And
absolutely.
I think a lot of work needs to be done.
Yes. Shaheda, let me bring Lithalethemba now as well here, because she's an attorney at the Center for Child Law. So tell me what progress we're making in terms of, especially for me, the 10 to 14-year-old, as Dr. Shaheda said, sexual consent starts from the age of 16. So everything below that, and these figures here, then it's statutory rape or sexual assault in it. So in terms of child law, have you seen increased cases of statutory rape as well at the center, as well as sexual assault for that age group?
Thank you for having me. So one of our cases that we actually did with the Teddy Bear Clinic was to decriminalize adolescent sexual activity. But going back to what Dr. Omar has said, children under 12 years old cannot consent to sexual activity. So by default, the 11-year-olds and the 10-year-olds were raped by our law, the Sexual Offences Act. And the age of consent in South Africa is 16 years old. And there is only two exceptions to that, where a person won't be found guilty of statutory rape. It is when there's a 2-year age difference between the young child and the person that they are interacting with, or it's the young children between the ages of 12 and 16 engaging in consensual sexual activity with each other. So everyone around above that who is older would be committing statutory rape. And as the center, we don't have privy to those statistics. We only get them, for example, through this article that came out. But it's important to note that in 2014, in the country itself, 20,000 children became pregnant. So it's very alarming that in Gauteng only, 23,000 plus children became pregnant, and it's probably an indication of what's happening in the country. And to remember, specifically with this period of lockdown, people couldn't go anywhere. So people couldn't go anywhere for the first few months. So it's very alarming that children were actually got pregnant during this time, because we were all locked in our homes. So one of the indicators is that something may have happened in the home or in the surrounding area. And even after that, you could only go to work, you could only go to the supermarket, you could only go to school. So during all of this time, it's important for all the departments to work together, to not just look at these stats and be alarmed, but actually social workers to get involved in all the children at 15 years and younger. Social workers need to get involved to investigate what are the circumstances of these pregnancies. Is it a relationship between children close in age, or are we having statutory rape? And for the children under 12 years old, it is rape under the Sexual Offences Act. So social workers need to get involved, SAPS needs to get involved with the assistance, because those children may need to actually either be removed from the home if it happened in the home, or they need to be assisted in order to be able to be witnesses in court. And one of the biggest problems in South Africa is that we've somehow normalized relationships of older adults and young children, and that's one of the things that we need to look into. And that is what these statistics are actually showing us, that we have a grave problem.
Yes. So what I did is I've spoken to educators, especially in schools where high risk, where they face this is the reality and this is a challenge. And so I've got, they just helped me conceptualize this issue and put it in context in terms of, number one, educators themselves are facing a challenge, because now you're not educating a child or teenage learner, you're educating a mother, and they find it incredibly difficult even to reprimand a learner for not doing homework because assignments are not done. One educator said, she's a life orientation educator. She has a teenage mother of a set of twins, but this particular learner prefers to bunk classes. Learning assessments are not handed in time, and it hasn't registered a process in terms of what she needs, the importance of education, especially now that she's a mother, and the educators are finding difficult, because now you essentially having to reprimand and discipline and inculcate a sense of responsibility to a mother. The other issues they have, as you've said, some of these learners, they are in a cycle because their parents had them when they were about 16, 17, 18, and now they become teenage mothers, and it's not even grannies that are supporting them, but it's actually their grannies. So great grannies are assisting with children. And when we engage, when the educators engage with them, actually they've seen that yes, it is rape by relatives. They live in a communal household. Just as they're expected to help with the household chores, it is expected that they need to offer their services to males in that area, in that room, in that locality, because they're being fed, they've been looked after. So just as chores are being done, as these are regarded as sexual chores. And yes, that's why they go unreported, because it's expected. So there's a huge reason.
I'd like to interject at this point. I think we need to be very careful. That's making a judgment call here, coming from a very therapeutic perspective. With children show bad behavior or mad behavior, there's usually a very sad girl behind that. We are dealing with children who have given birth to children, as you have expressed. We need to understand there's underlying unmet emotional needs. So when you say children are defaulting on their school performance, it's because of unresolved issues. It's more complex. And that's where
No,
we
no,
are.
yeah. But what I'm saying, from educators' point of view, they also struggling in terms of their dealing and where do they offer support? Where does it line cross in terms of being an
But you need
educator?
to also
Yes,
understand. You need to understand when we say that there aren't sufficient resources and budget allocation.
absolutely,
Exactly the
absolutely.
case.
And mhm.
We don't
I,
have sufficient school social workers. We don't have psychological services. And if we look at the marginalized communities, they lack all the adequate resources where educators feel unsupported and obviously do not know how to manage the situation. And that is why I say it requires intervention on a much broader scale, not from just one specific angle. This is a
yes,
multi-faceted, multi-dimensional problem.
absolutely. Because as I said, you train as an educator, but you don't have you, especially if you are FET or high school educator, on the content in terms of how you assist learners with barriers to learning in terms of cognitive processes. I mean, you don't necessarily get trained in these type of societal issues. So professional development in this sense is required with school social workers, counselors in there to guide these educators, because these are the challenges, and everybody's finding difficulties. I agree with a multi-faceted approach in terms of this. But let me just bring Buyiswa now. How do we go forward in terms of preventative methods? Yes, we have these teenage mothers who definitely require counseling, social support, educational support, uh, nurturing. I mean, they are young children here who are in the system as well. They will need mentorship, guidance from, well, it looks like single parents as well. So, you know what, something like maybe a role model, a father figure as well. But how do we go from here in terms of preventing this, in terms of lowering this number, maybe from April 2021 until next year, to say, you know what, through various intervention programs, we've managed to successfully reduce this rate of teenage pregnancy. So, what do we go from here within an educational framework?
I think my colleague Lita has said it well. The fact that right now we are all shocked of the statistics, and the doctor has just also mentioned that it is a multifaceted problem and more complex than the numbers that we are being presented. And education sector alone cannot be will not be able to really effect a bigger change, but we cannot be trapped in that sense of despair. What we need to do, we need to look at how can we intensify the messaging within the school environment with all the learners, including both boys and girls, in terms of our life orientation subject area, where they are taught these life skills around making informed decisions. But also, when we look at the causes of teenage pregnancy, it goes beyond for those young adolescents that we are talking about, who then perhaps who also chooses to engage in sexual activity. It also goes beyond than just the issue of being curious about sex. The other side of the coin is the fact that and this also speaks to these numbers now in this year when we were on lockdown, is the issue also of access to sexual reproductive health services, in terms of access to non-judgmental contraceptives for those adolescents and young people who choose to engage in sexual activity. It also speaks to issues of, if you followed research around some of the causes, is the issue of okay, we've spoken to that of sexual cohesion, that most adolescents, when they are engaging in relationships, they are actually not engaging in order to get sex. To get children, but then they find themselves in a situation where they are then disempowered to actually negotiate safer sex with their partners. So we need to look at how do we empower them in that regard. Then we also need to look at issues of poverty. We cannot underplay how poverty comes into play when it comes to young people making choices around protecting themselves from these unintended and unplanned pregnancies, because some of these older men who are engaging in relationships with these young girls and adolescents is that they come with the promise of provision, financial provision, and then the young woman and the adolescent girl then does not have that power to protect herself against this unintended pregnancy, even though it will have this long lasting effect, trapping her including her baby in that poverty cycle. But the Department of Education, if I may speak, it has a program that is called Adolescent and Girls and Young Women program, where specific interventions, and they have actually now in the last year engaged with community-based organizations and partnered with community-based organizations so that they can go into into the communities and work with these adolescent girls, where they try to provide services and information around the issue of protecting themselves against risky behaviors. But we actually need to enhance and strengthen the collaboration between Department of Education, Department of Health, around issues of ensuring that our young adolescent girls and young women who choose to engage in sex, they have access to contraception, they have access to services that can prevent them from falling pregnant. But we cannot underplay the role of communities as well as other partners, stakeholders within community, where we must continue to engage with young people on alternative ways of lifestyles, in terms of pursuing their life goals, in terms of education, in terms of, and this is unfortunate also that sport has been found to be lacking in schools, and also that lockdown has had an impact on the programming within schools that that adolescents and young women attend. But we need to increase access to alternative lifestyles for our young people, so that they not necessarily falling into the trap of just finding themselves falling pregnant without having intended to fall pregnant. And then we must engage social development as well, because
So I just want to interrupt you here. You know what?
mm,
Again, I'm listening, and it's essential. This, but I just hear it's again burden of responsibility on females. Our young girls need to do this. Is there programs where we engage males? We engage the males in terms of their responsibilities in this, because often it's the females then have to carry this burden of responsibility, emotions of being pregnant, then being a young mother, having to look after them, the economic impact of this, and where are those fathers? And then you have these children, young children growing up without male role models. So are there specific programs? Does the Department of Education and Social Development have specific programs changing narrative and mindset for males to become more responsible, and also understand that they are responsible in terms of when a teenage girl becomes pregnant, as well as change attitudes, maybe harsher sentences for those, especially for the 10 to 14-year-old group in terms of this. So, yes, a focus on changing this narrative as well. Is there some program in that way as well?
so yes,
I
so the
can come in.
adolescent girl. Okay.
Okay, Dr. Omar, you can come in there.
Yes, so we have a specific program for young sex offenders. These are children who are sexually aggressive towards other children. And we have conducted comprehensive studies where the research indicates that more than 43% of sexual offenses are committed by children against other children. And most of them are boys. And we have specific programs targeting at the boys with their families. The child is not worked with in isolation, but worked together. And where possible, we also engage them with victim offender mediation. But And we also do a lot of prevention. So when we talk about preventative programs, where we go out to schools, we go out to communities and engage with boys, male children, and male adults. And of course, I think it's not sufficient. It's not adequately being done. It's only civil society that is probably playing a role here, and more active engagement from different departments, from different organizations and constitutions has a huge role to play in ensuring that the boy child and the girl child are both included in prevention and intervention, and of course looking at rehabilitation and reintegration as a society.
And I'm so pleased, as you've said, this is from civil society, but an NGO capacity. But there are programs here, and I think maybe this is where collaborations need to happen, because, as you said, you've done research in this type of programs, and maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but just inject more resources in such programs and make sure that these programs are then taken nationwide in terms of this, because it's already there. And I know, Dr. Shaheda, yourself and your team have done extensive research both in these programs as well as rehabilitation of these offenders. So I just like to, we caught up with time, but Lithalethemba, from your point of view in terms of educational programs at the Center for Child Law, are there any preventative programs as well as support programs for these teenage mothers now?
So just going back, I think it's very important to equip children even at school level, because we know some parents don't think condoning sexual activity among teens is right. So one of the places where children can actually get holistic sexual and reproductive kind of assistance and actual help is through school and the LO subject. And one of the things we're seeing is that a lot of people are fighting that because they see it as we're teaching children to have sex. And no, it's teaching children about consent. It's teaching children about what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior from their peers as well as adults. And one of the big things is that since 2016, the Department of Education was supposed to create a learner pregnancy policy to deal with learners who have actually fallen pregnant, to make sure that they don't actually get expelled out of school. They are able to carry on with their education in order to better their lives. And one of the things is that teachers may say that it's difficult to reprimand a pregnant learner or a young mother. But going back to what Dr. Omar has said, it is important to check, because like any other naughty child, you need to get to the root of the problem. Why is the child acting in this manner? And that is when you call in your social workers to then come and investigate and say, this child is acting in this manner, we cannot reprimand them. Even in the Schools Act, there are ways to reprimand a child. So if the child is not listening and nothing is working, you then have to take disciplinary actions, but also having that background knowledge that this child actually is a parent. You can call in social workers to actually investigate. Was this child a child who had a child during a consensual encounter with a peer, or is it a sexual offense? Because part of the problem is that children experience a lot of sexual violence in their homes, and then they come and display these behaviors that cannot be controlled by either the parent or the teacher. And those are children who are actually in need of care and protection. So we need to strengthen our departments. I don't even think it's necessary to funnel more finances. It's social workers need to also get involved, and actually, because this falls under their jurisdiction. So making sure that you actually know what the individual circumstances of a particular child are so that you can address them.
Thanks so much. This has been a very informative, insightful discussion, and I thank all three of you for your expertise and knowledge. And I'd like to catch up with you sometime later in the year in terms of seeing if various intervention programs have been put in place, so that hopefully we can equip our young male and female learners in terms of their roles and responsibilities and ability to make informed, empowering decisions to prevent such pregnancies going forward. Thank you, and good morning to all my guests, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay. And we're going to go for a short break, and then we're going to be honoring crying and the benefits of a good cry. All this after the break.